Workers Confront the Bureaucracy by Cornelius Castoriadis. This was originally published in Socialisme ou Barbarie in 1956. Fuck me, dude. As soon as I start reading, I'm sneezing again. Allergy season. Alright. Fuck. The preceding articles provide a complete description as could be desired of the main working class struggles of 1955 in France, England, and the United States. It is not an obsession with information, the numbers of people who participate in these struggles, their physical combativeness, or even the concessions one that justifies the length of these articles, is that these struggles assume in our eyes a historical significance by virtue of their content. For the reader who has glanced through the preceding pages, we are not getting ahead of the conclusions of this article if we say that in the summer of 1955 the proletariat has manifested itself in a new way. It has autonomously determined its objectives and its measure and its means of struggle. It has posed the problem of how to set up its own autonomous organization, and finally it has defined itself against this bureaucracy and separated itself from it in a fashion that is pregnant with future consequences. The first sign of the proletariat's new attitude toward the bureaucracy undoubtedly was the revolt of the East Berlin and East German proletariat in June 1953 against the Stalinist bureaucracy in power there. During the summer of 1955, this same separation between the proletariat and the, quote, working class, end quote, bureaucracy became clearly apparent in the main Western capitalist countries. The important thing is that hereafter this separation becomes an active separation. The proletariat no longer merely refuses to cooperate with the bureaucracy by failing to act. The proletariat no longer understands the opposition between its interest and those of the trade union and political leaders in a merely passive way. Indeed, it no longer even limits itself to entering into struggle against bureaucratic orders. It is entering into struggle against the bureaucracy in person. England, the United States, or conducts its struggle as if the bureaucracy did not exist, reducing it to insignificance and impotence by the tremendous weight of its active presence, France. We need to retrace a few of our steps in order to put these events in perspective. A few years ago, Marxists of every stripe, quote Marxist, end quote, of every stripe, generally agreed that problems concerning the relations between the proletariat and the, quote, working class, end quote, bureaucracy could be ignored. Some thought there was no proletariat outside bureaucratized organizations, and therefore not outside the bureaucracy. Others thought the workers could only slavishly follow the bureaucracy or else give in to apathy, and that they had to take sides with it. Others still, who were more valiant, claimed that the workers had forgotten everything, that they had to have their class consciousness re-educated. There was a different motivation for the paranoia of, quote, orthodox, end quote, Trotskyists, but the inferences they drew were the inferences they drew were the same, since for them the bureaucracy was only the product of a fortuitous set of circumstances that was bound to burst apart as soon as the workers entered into struggle. For this, one merely had to take up again the good old Bolshevik slogans and offer the workers a, quote, honest, end quote, party and trade union. We have always affirmed in this review against the conspiracy of mystifiers of all different allegiances that the true problem of the present epoch is the problem of the relations between workers and the bureaucracy. The proletariat had to go through an unprecedented experience that would have to continue for a long time, since the, quote, working class, end quote, bureaucracy, deeply rooted as it was in the economic, political, and social development of capitalism, could not be toppled overnight. Of necessity, the workers were going through a quiet period of maturation, for it was not possible for them to purely and simply take up again against the bureaucracy the methods of struggle and the organizational forms traditionally used against capitalism. But in addition, we also argue that this historically necessary experience would lead the proletariat to formulate concretely and definitively its own forms of organization and rule. The development of contemporary society will become more and more dominated by the increasing separation and opposition between the proletariat and the bureaucracy. As this opposition deepens, new organizational forms will begin to emerge that will allow the workers to abolish the power of the exploiters, whoever they may be, and to rebuild society on new foundations. This process is still only in its embryonic stage. The first elements of this process, however, already have begun to appear. After the East Berlin workers came out in June 1953, the metal workers of Nantes, that's how you say that, the workers of London and Liverpool, and the automobile workers of Detroit have clearly shown in 1955 that they would rely on themselves alone in their struggle against exploitation. The significance of the strike at Nantes. I'm going to actually look up how to pronounce that. So, bear with me. Discord.
Nantes.
The significance of the strikes at Nantes. To understand the working class struggles of the summer of 1955, and especially those in Nantes, we must place these struggles within the context of how the French proletariat has developed since 1945. In contrast to the initial period following the, quote, liberation, end quote, where on the whole the workers followed the policy of the bureaucratic organizations, and in particular that of the Communist Party, beginning in 1947 to 48, we find the workers becoming markedly more and more, quote, unstuck, end quote, from these organizations. The proletariat starts from its experience of their real attitude. It begins to subject these organizations to a silent criticism and to express this criticism in reality by refusing to follow their orders any longer. This, quote, coming unstuck, end quote, this refusal to cooperate takes several quite distinct forms that follow one another chronologically. 1. From 1948 to 1952, the workers' total and obstinate refusal to follow bureaucratic orders is expressed by inaction and apathy. In the majority of cases, strikes called by Stalinists are not respected, not only in the case of, quote, political, end quote, strikes, but even strikes over economic issues. This is not simply a matter of discouragement. There is also the awareness that the Communist Party is using working class struggles and diverting them from their class goals in order to serve Russian policy. The proof of this is that in the rare cases in which, quote, united action, end quote, between Stalinist, reformist, and Christian unions is achieved, the workers readily enter into action, not because they attach some value to this unity as such, but because they see in it the proof that the struggle in question cannot easily be diverted toward bureaucratic ends, and because they will not be divided among themselves. 2. In August 1953, millions of workers spontaneously go on strike without orders from the trade union bureaucracies or even against orders. Nevertheless, once on strike, they leave the actual leadership of the strike up to the unions, and the strike itself is, quote, passive, end quote. Building occupations are extremely rare, and at strike meetings, the base almost never makes its presence felt except through voting. During the summer of 1995, the workers again spontaneously enter into struggle, but that is not all they do. At Nantes, at Saint-Nazaire, and in other localities, they do not simply go on strike, nor are they even content to occupy buildings. They go on the offensive, support their demands by exerting extraordinary physical pressure, demonstrating in the streets and battling with the CRS. The CRS being like a strike, I think a strike-breaking section of the police force. They no longer leave the leadership of the struggle up to the union bureaucrats. At the height of the struggle in Nantes, they have such total control over the union bureaucrats through their direct collective pressure that in negotiating with the boss, the union officials merely play the role of agent, or rather of mouthpiece. The real leaders are the workers themselves. One must not get the different significations one must not get the different significations belonging to these successive attitudes mixed up. What they have in common is that the workers are detaching themselves from the traditional leadership groups. But as the awareness of the opposition between working class interest and bureaucratic policy grows, the workers express this awareness in their concrete behavior by becoming more and more active. Expressed at the outset as a simple refusal to cooperate and in the form of inaction, by 1955 it takes the concrete form of working class activity in which the class starts to take full control over all aspects of its struggle with no intermediary. This can plainly be seen if one reflects on the events that have taken place in Nantes. People have tried to see in the strikes at Nantes and Saint-Nazaire essentially a demonstration of working class violence, some in order to rejoice in it, others in order to grieve about it. And certainly we should even start off by noting how rare it is for working class struggles to reach such a level of violence during a period in which the regime is stable. Much more important than the degree of violence, however, is the manner in which this violence was brought to bear. The direction in which it was oriented and the relations it expressed between the workers on one side and the apparatus of the capitalist state and the trade union bureaucracies on the other. To be more precise, the extent of violence modified its content and brought this working class action onto a wholly different level. The Nantes workers did not act violently because they were following the orders of some bureaucracy, as it occurred to a certain extent in 1948 during the miners' strike. They acted against union orders. This violence signified that the workers had established a permanent and active presence in the strike and in negotiations, and thus were they allowed not to exert some degree of control over the unions, but rather to overtake these unions altogether in an absolutely unforeseen manner. There is not the least doubt about the willingness of the trade union leaders throughout the strike to limit the struggle in its duration, in its extent, in the import of its demands, and in the methods employed as to obtain an agreement as rapidly as possible and to bring everything back to order. However, these irreplaceable, quote, chiefs, end quote, trembled before the 15,000 metal workers who had taken over the streets and would not give them back. Their, quote, action, end quote, during the strike is invisible to the naked eye, and only through some wretched behind-the-scenes maneuvers were they able to play the role of saboteurs. Even while negotiations were going on, they were nothing more than a telephone line transmitting demands unanimously formulated by the workers themselves, until the workers discovered that this line was of no use and stormed into the negotiating room. Certainly, neither the defects nor the negative aspects of the Nantes movement can be ignored. Though it had overtaken the unions in reality, the movement had not eliminated the unions as such. The attitude of the workers of Nantes contains a radical challenge to the trade unions. They trust them neither to define their demands, nor to defend them, nor to negotiate for them, and they rely only on themselves. The total distrust they have expressed in their actions is infinitely more important than what these same workers might, quote, think, end quote, or, quote, say, end quote, at the same time, or whom they might have voted for during the recent legislative elections. Nevertheless, contradictions in the workers' attitude persist. First of all, these contradictions exist between their way of, quote, thinking, end quote, as it emerges in discussions about voting on trade union or political issues prior or subsequent to the strike, and their mode of, quote, acting, end quote, which is the strike itself. In the former case, the union merely is tolerated as the lesser evil. In the latter case, it is ignored. Even within this mode of acting, contradictions persist. The workers are, so to speak, both, quote, on the near side, end quote, beyond, end quote, the problem of bureaucracy. They are on the near side insofar as they leave the bureaucracy in place, do not attack it head on, do not substitute for it their own elected organizations. Yet they also are beyond this problem. For on the terrain where they are situated, a total struggle wrought through their permanent presence turns the bureaucracy's role into a minor role. Truly speaking, they are preoccupied with it very little. Occupying the stage in massive numbers, they leave the bureaucracy to play as it will behind the scenes, and the backstage hardly counts during the first act. The trade unions cannot yet do any harm. The workers are too detached from them. This detachment does not culminate, it will be said, however, in a positive crystallization in the form of getting organized on their own, independent of the unions. There is not even an elected strike committee representing the strikers, responsible to the strikers, etc. One could draw up an entire list of such defects, but they are of only limited import. One can say certainly that the movement did not arrive at an autonomous form of organization. But in saying so, one shows that one already has a certain organizational form in mind. There is no form of organization that is more autonomous than 15,000 workers acting unanimously in the streets. That last sentence was in italics. But again, it will be said that by not electing a strike committee directly responsible to them and revocable at any time, the workers gave the union bureaucrats room to maneuver. Well, this is true, but how can one not see that the workers could not have exercised more control even over an elected strike committee than they exercised over these union representatives on August 17th? Who cannot see that such a committee would not have been able to do anything more at that time than what these representatives did under pressure from the workers? When the mass of workers, united as one body, clearly knowing what it wants and completely determined to get it, is constantly present at the scenes of action, what more can elected strike committee offer? The importance of such a committee is to be found everywhere. On the one hand, it could have tried to extend the struggle beyond Nantes. On the other hand, during the period in which the movement began to experience setbacks, it could have tried to help the workers better defend themselves against the maneuvers of the trade unions and the bosses. But we should not create any illusion about the actual role it might have been able to play. The extension of the movement depended very little on some appeals of a Nantes committee. Some appeals a Nantes committee might have been able to launch, and much more on other conditions that had not gelled. The conduct of the negotiations during the phase in which the movement was in decline had a relatively secondary importance. It was the relation of force in the city that remained decisive, and it was becoming less and less favorable. Obviously, we are far from criticizing the notion of an elected strike committee in general, or even in the case of Nantes. We're simply saying that in this latter case, and seeing the level the worker struggle attained, the significance of its action would have been in any case secondary. If the action of the Nantes workers had not been crowned with total victory, it is because it was up against objective contradictions that could not have been altered at all by the election of a strike committee. The dynamic of the development of the struggle in Nantes indeed had resulted in a contradiction that may be defined in the following terms. Revolutionary methods were utilized in a situation that was not, and for goals that were not, revolutionary. The strike was followed by factory occupations. The bosses countered by calling in the CRS regiments. The workers countered by attacking the CRS. Could this struggle have gone any further? But what was any further than that? The seizure of power in Nantes? This contradiction, in fact, would be carried to the point of paroxysm if organs, which in this situation could have only a revolutionary content, were set up. Any committee that would have considered the situation seriously would have resigned, or the next thing it would have done would have been to start methodically driving the CRS out of the city. But with what prospect? We're not saying that the Nantes workers were using such hindsight. What we are saying is that the objective logic of the situation did not afford much sense to any attempt to set up a permanent workers' organization. But it will be said such a prospect existed. It was possible to extend the movement. Once again, one surreptitiously introduces one's own ideas into the real situation, which does not conform to them. For the Nantes workers, it was a local strike with a precise objective, a 40-franc raise. It was not for them the first act of a revolution. It was not a question for them of getting caught up in such an effort. They used the revolutionary means to get their claims settled. Therein we have the very essence of our era. But that does not mean revolution is possible at every instant. It has been claimed, however, that it was, quote, objectively possible, end quote, to extend this movement. And certainly, if the bourgeoisie needed 8,000 CRS agents to hold out with great difficulty against 15,000 workers, we do not see where it would have found the forces required to hold out against 5 million workers throughout the whole country. But the fact is that the French working class was not ready to enter into such decisive action, and it did not enter into it. The features we have analyzed here come together only in the Nantes movement. They appear in an embryonic form only in a few other localities, and they form an impressive contrast to the absence of any large movement in the Parisian region. At the very moment the struggles at Nantes were unfolding, the Renault plant in France presents us with the most classical picture of dispersion. The workers there seem to be having the hardest time overcoming the discreet sabotage efforts being carried out by their union leaders. To say under such conditions that the failure to extend the movement is due to the attitude of the bureaucratic union federations is meaningless. This merely says that these union federations accomplish their mission. The Trotskyists act surprised and curse them. Others understand that the union federations will be able to play their role only as long as the workers have not attained the degree of clarity and decisiveness necessary to act on their own. If the Parisian worker had wanted to enter into the struggle, could the unions have prevented them from doing so? Probably not. The proof, precisely this: Nantes. There are, in the last analysis, two ways of looking at the relation between the action of the Nantes workers and the inaction of the majority of the French proletariat. One way is to stress the isolation of the Nantes movement and to try, starting from this point, to limit its import. This view is correct if one wants to appreciate the nature of the present situation. One must guard against adventurous interpretations and recall that the French proletariat is not on the verge of undertaking an all-out struggle. But this view is false if one wants to look at the significance of the methods of action used in Nantes, the attitude of workers confronting the bureaucracy, and the direction of the process of maturation underway among the working class. From this point of view, a revolutionary will always say, if the Nantes workers, isolated in their province, showed much maturity in their struggle, then the majority of French workers, and in particular the Parisian workers, will create, when they enter into movement, still more advanced, more effective, and more radical organizational forms and forms of action. In acting as they did, as a coherent mass, as a domestic collectivity in movement, the workers of Nantes achieved for one long moment an autonomous form of organization that contains, in embryo, the answer to the following important question. What is the proletarian form of organization that is capable of doing away with the bureaucracy and the capitalist state? The answer is that, at an elementary level, this form is nothing but the total mass of workers themselves. The mass is not only, as some have wanted to believe and make others believe for a long time, the shock power, the quote, infantry, end quote, of class action. When the conditions are right, it develops astonishing capacities for self-organization, self-direction, and self-leadership. It establishes within itself the necessary differentiation of functions without crystallizing them into structural differentiations. There is a division of tasks that is not a division of labor. Indeed, at Nantes, there were workers who manufactured, quote, bombs, end quote, while others made contacts, but there was no, quote, headquarters, end quote, no, quote, general staff, end quote, either an official one or a secret one. This, quote, elementary nucleus, end quote, of the working class proved itself equal to the problems posed to it, and capable of mastering almost every form of resistance it encountered. We rightly say, quote, an embryo of an answer, end quote. We say a, quote, embryo, end quote, not only because Nantes was a real situation and not a model, nor just because, aside from these features, one encounters others that betoken difficulties and defeats for the working masses. All this is secondary, since for us what is of prime importance in the present situation is that which prefigures future developments. We also say a, quote, embryo, end quote, because there are clear limitations on this form of organization in time, in space, and in relation to universal and permanent goals. Today, however, this is not what we are concerned with. Before going any further, we must make sense of what already has happened. What conditions permitted the Nantes movement to reach this level in the first place? The fundamental condition was the virtual unanimity of the participants. This unanimity, which is genuine working class unity, ought not, of course, to be confused with what Stalinists or Trotskyists call unity of action. This type of unity, even when it pretends to be concerned with the grassroots, in fact is only the unity of its bureaucracies. It existed in Nantes, but it was the result of the working class unity. It was imposed on the bureaucracy by the workers. Not that the workers were ever bothered for an instant or, quote, demanded, end quote, that their leaders get unified. In fact, they ignored them and acted unanimously. The bureaucrats then understood that their only chance to maintain any contact with the movement at all was to act like they were, quote, united, end quote. Working class unanimity manifested itself, first of all, on the level of defining the basic demand. Unless we are wrong, no one to this day knows, quote, who, end quote, put forth the slogan of a 40-franc raise for everyone. In any case, it wasn't the unions. One would seek in vain to find such an objective in their programs. Moreover, by its non-hierarchical character, the Nantes workers' demand goes directly against every union's program. All the more remarkable is that this unanimity was achieved on a demand for a uniform wage increase for everyone among workers with highly differentiated pay scales. The unanimity likewise manifested itself on the struggle of what means were to be employed. This was true all during the struggle. At each new turn in the, quote, tactical, end quote, situation, the workers spontaneously and collectively provided the adequate response. They went from a strike with no fixed duration to a factory occupation and then to action against the CRS. Last, there was total unanimity on the worker's own role. You win only what you yourself fight for. No one but the workers themselves could be relied upon, not even the unions and the, quote, working classes, end quote, parties. These unions and parties stood condemned in bloc through the actions of the Nantes workers. This attitude toward the bureaucracy obviously results from having had a profound objective experience of it. We cannot dwell on this point here, which by itself alone merits a long examination. Let us say simply that the conditions for this experience were provided in France by one elementary fact. After 10 years of, quote, action and trade union demagogy, the workers are discovering that they were able to stop their condition from deteriorating only when they went on strike. Let us add that even the partial success of the Nantes and Saint-Nazaire movements will drive this experience forward because it furnishes it with a new counterproof. In a few weeks' time, these movements have won more for the workers than 10 years of trade union, quote, negotiations, end quote, have won. The analysis of these conditions demonstrates that the form taken by the Nantes movement is not an aberrant one, and still less a residue of some allegedly, quote, primitive, end quote, traits, but rather the product of factors at work everywhere that show to present-day society the face of its own future. The mass democracy in Nantes has sprung from working-class unanimity. Working-class unanimity, in its turn, has resulted from the working class's awareness of its own basic interests and from a common experience it has shared of capitalism and bureaucracy. The premises for this common experience are magnified day after day by the very action of capitalists and bureaucrats. The common characteristics of the strikes in France, England, and the United States. An analysis similar to the one we have attempted here would have to be done in the case of the English dock worker and American automobile worker strikes. Such analyses would allow us to bring out other characteristics of these movements that would be equally profound and pregnant with consequences. To cite just one, the growing importance that demands other than those related to wages begin to take on, as capitalism and the proletariat develop concomitantly. Of prime importance are demands relating to working conditions. These kinds of demands lead directly to the problem of how to organize production. Ultimately, it poses the problem of how to manage. We cannot undertake such an analysis here. The reader can refer to the articles devoted to these struggles in the preceding pages of this issue. It is important, nevertheless, to determine what right now are the characteristics common to all these movements. The principal one is obvious, namely the workers' overt and militant opposition to bureaucracy, their refusal to, quote, let themselves be represented, end quote. This has taken the most explicit form possible in England. English dock workers went on strike for 7 weeks against the trade union bureaucracy itself and no one else. Just like the East German workers in 1953, the English dock workers attacked the bureaucracy, here, quote, socialist, end quote, there, quote, communist, end quote, as the direct enemy. The attack was scarcely less explicit in the United States. The auto workers' strikes that followed the signing of the CIO-Ford General Motors agreements on the guaranteed annual wage certainly were directed against the bosses as far as the content of demands were concerned, but at the same time, they formed a striking demonstration of the workers' repudiation of trade union policy. They were equivalent to saying to the trade unions, "You do not represent us. Your concerns are not our interest, and what interests us you ignore." We have seen finally that in France the Nantes workers have, quote, left the bureaucracy aside, end quote, during their struggle to have merely, quote, used, end quote, union bureaucrats in minor parts. In the second place, there is no trace of any kind of, quote, outflanking, end quote, of the bureaucracy in any of these movements. These struggles are not contained, so to speak, from the start in a bureaucratic framework, within which they would develop and which they would eventually, quote, outflank, end quote. The bureaucracy has been made obsolete. The movement takes place from the very outset on another terrain. That was in italics. That does not mean that the bureaucracy is abolished or that the proletariat now evolves in a world where it no longer can encounter this bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is still there, and the proletariat's relations with bureaucracy are not only complex but confused. The bureaucracy is at the same time proxy, enemy, immediate object for applying pressure and negligible quantity. But there is one thing it no longer is: a leadership accepted and followed in the course of struggles, or even at their commencement. The Trotskyist concept of outflanking, the Trotskyist conception of outflanking, a theoretical reconstruction of Lenin's practice against social democracy, and in particular the experience of 1917, presupposed that at the start the masses are situated on the same terrain as their, quote, traitorous, end quote, leaders, and will remain under their hold until the experience they have acquired with the aid of the Revolutionary Party in the course of their struggles frees them from these leadership groups. Now contemporary experience and that of 1955 above all shows that the masses enter into action starting from an experience of bureaucracy that precedes this action itself, and which therefore is independent of the bureaucracy, if not against the bureaucracy. For in the meantime, the bureaucracy has acquired an objective existence as an integral part of the system of exploitation. In 1917, Menshevism was only a form of discourse. Stalinism, the Labor Party, and the CIO are, to various degrees, forms of power. We thus are led to a third consideration. From 1923 to 1953, revolutionaries were reduced to impotently contemplating a vicious circle. The working class was able to gain a definitive experience of various bureaucratic leadership groups only in the course of its struggles. But the very existence of these leadership groups and the hold they exercised meant that these struggles quite simply were never launched at all, or these struggles were defeated, or finally, that they remained till the end under the control of the bureaucracy, which therefore made use of these struggles for that bureaucracy's own ends. We are not presenting a theory here, but rather a condensed and accurate description of the last 30 years of history of the labor movement. For example, the very existence of Stalinism and the hold it has exercised prevented the proletariat's experience from developing in a revolutionary direction during periods of crisis. It does not change anything to say that this was due to the absence of a revolutionary party. Stalinism's hold signified that the very possibility of setting up a revolutionary party had been suppressed. Above all, it meant the physical elimination of anybody who tried to become a revolutionary militant. Now the struggles of the summer of 1955 are a first sign that the vicious circle has been broken. It has been broken by the action of the working class itself, starting out from its accumulated experience. This experience has not been an experience of the bureaucracy's role as the, quote, traitorous, end quote, leadership of revolutionary struggles, but rather the bureaucracy's daily activity as warden of capitalist exploitation. For this experience to blossom, it is not necessary for the bureaucracy to come to power. The workings of the economic system on the one hand and the daily elementary class struggle on the other inexorably forced the bureaucracy to become an integral part of the system of exploitation and to reveal its true nature to the workers. Just as it was impossible to build up a revolutionary organization by explaining to French workers how Stalinism committed class betrayal in China in 1927, so now it is possible. Just as it was impossible to build up a revolutionary organization by explaining to French workers how Stalinism committed class betrayal in China in 1927, so now is it possible to build such an organization by helping them organize in their daily struggle against exploitation and against the instruments of the exploitation in the labor unions and among the, quote, working class, end quote, political parties. What conclusions can we draw from this analysis of the problem of how to organize the proletariat and its vanguard? The Nantes strike, as well as the English dock workers' strike, show the adequate organizational form for workers in action. We will not hark back again to the content of this form or its potential limitations. By the very nature of things, and until a new order is established, however, such forms neither are nor can be permanent under the capitalist system of rule. The problem of how to organize working-class minorities during periods of inaction remains. Nevertheless, it is now posed in a new way. First of all, we must state that the degree of maturity of the struggles of 1955 have revealed prevents us from posing the question of, quote, economic demands, end quote, political demands, end quote, separately. We have known for a long time that they are objectively indissociable. They also will become more and more indissociable in the minds of the workers. A militant minority of workers organized in a plan, whether that minority of workers adopt the form of a committee of struggle, a group united around a workers' journal, or an autonomous union, will have to affirm this indivisibility in the clearest possible terms from the very outset. We do not mean by this that it should indulge in any Trotskyist magic tricks, which produce demands for a 5-franc raise, a general strike, and revolution like so many rabbits out of a hat. On the contrary, it should scrupulously avoid such sleight-of-hand tricks and condemn the charlatans who indulge in them if they show their faces. In 999 cases out of 1,000, a strike for 5 francs is a strike for 5 francs and nothing more. Or rather, the something more contained in the strike comes not from what the strike brings to the struggle for power, but from that which the strike runs up against. Under one form or another, in the apparatus of capitalist domination that is internal to the factory system, that is incarnated by the, quote, working class, end quote, bureaucracy. Only by bringing to light its total nature, which is simultaneously economic, political, and ideological, will one be able to organize the struggle against this bureaucracy. At the same time, workers cannot move effectively among the multiple contradictions that even the most elementary struggle for economic demands under the conditions of declining capitalism give rise to. Contradictions we have pointed out in the Nantes example, unless they come to situate their struggles in a more general perspective. Supplying this perspective is the essential function of organized minorities. We must also understand, however, that even when it is a matter of such elementary struggles, the task of organized minorities is to aid in the growth of democratic collective forms of organization, run by the mass of workers themselves. Nantes has furnished us with an example of this kind of organization. These types of organizational forms already have proved to be the only effective ones. More and more, they will prove to be the only possible ones.